Second. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the second presentation of day 2 of the Sanibel Island Writers Conference. I'm very excited to introduce Lynne Barrett, Joe Clifford, and Stephen Womack. And they're going to be talking about plot. And I'll just say this, back in the 90s, I was in the MFA program at Florida International University in Miami, and Lynn was my professor. And she was also my thesis advisor. And at the time, I was writing a bunch of very short stories. And a couple of people pulled me aside and they said, you should really be writing a novel if you're working with Lynne Barrett, because she is the plot queen. Like she will make your novel into such a great page turner if you just figure out how to write a novel. And that's not where my head was at the time. So I did short stories. And I think they're better stories because I worked with Lynn. So as always, I wrote down some notes about these people because I don't want to miss any of their accomplishments. So I'll just say Lynne Barrett is the author of multiple short story collections, including Magpies and the Secret Names of Women. Magpies won the Gold Award for the Florida Book of the Year Award. She also wrote What Editors Want. And she is the editor of Making Good Time, True Stories of How We Do and Don't Get Around in South Florida. And as I said before, she teaches at Florida International University in Miami, and she is also an Edgar Award winner. Joe Clifford, this is amazing to me, Joe. Joe Clifford is a former homeless heroin addict. I mean, as if becoming a writer isn't hard enough. And to add to that, coming back from being homeless and an addict and then being as prolific and successful as you have been in the last decade is miraculous. He is the author of Junkie Love, the J. Porter Thriller series, and the editor of Trouble in the Heartland, crime stories on the songs of Bruce Springsteen, and also the forthcoming Just to Watch Him Die, crime fiction inspired by the songs of Johnny Cash. He's also the host of Lip Service West, which I'm assuming is associated with Andrea Askowitz and Lip Service in Miami.
Yeah, I stole a few ideas. It's kind of hiatus right now with everything else, I guess. Life.
And finally, we have Stephen Womack, who is the author of over 10 novels, including Murphy's Fault, Dead Folks Blues, which won the Edgar Allan Poe Award as Best Paperback Original, and Murder Manual, which won the Shamus Award. He's also a screenwriter whose scripts have been made into made-for-TV movies. And Stephen, you and I have been going back and forth for a few years about getting you to Sanibel. And I can't even remember how we first got in touch. Was it through Ditto Montiel?
I can't remember either. I don't know the name. I don't know that name.
Okay.
I think I may have just cold queried you. I think I sent you an email one day.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you did.
So great.
Yeah, I'm glad you did, and I'm glad we finally got you involved in the conference this year.
Thrilled to be here, Tom. Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks to all of you for participating this year, and have a great session. Everyone, welcome these 3 wonderful authors in their discussion on plot.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to start us off a little. I just noticed there's already tons of comments greeting us and a couple of testimonials. Marinda Dennis met with me at the Sanibel conference, and the piece I critiqued has been published. I'll take all credit for that. And there's some other comments on here about the conference as well. So just saying we're warmly welcomed. Virtual applause is coming in the chat. Thank you very much. Plot is a very broad word, big topic, and means a lot to different people. And so I think when we spoke together before, we were talking about different ways that we've approached it, and also in various ways learned to explain it to others. And so I'm happy to hand over to Steve or Joe to get us going on that, whichever one wants to hop in. Yes, have it. It's yours.
Okay. Let me start by saying that when I deploy the word plot, I tend to use it as an active verb rather than a noun. I think in terms of how am I going to plot this story, this novel, script, whatever you're working on, rather than plot being like a fixed, rigid thing. To me, it's dynamic. It changes as the work progresses, as you get further and further into it. And a lot of that is rooted in my training as a screenwriter. Back in the 80s, I decided very early I wanted to be a writer, and I started writing novels when I was 18. And 15 years later, I'd written like 5 completed novels and 4 or 5 others that died on the vine. I couldn't give them away. And I saw an ad for a continuing education course in screenwriting. And I thought, of course, well, I've watched a lot of movies. How hard can it be to write one? And I learned that it was a lot harder. But I went into a class with a screenwriting teacher, and screenwriting is where they really drill into you. Plot, only they call it structure. Structure to a screenwriter is everything. The events that you choose to put on page or on screen to portray the story, your character's story, and the order in which you put them is absolutely essential to making the story work. And this was a game changer for me. I suddenly started going back and applying this level of craft on top of the voice and the art and all the other stuff that I've been taught in creative writing classes. And suddenly it started to work. So the idea of spending a great deal of time concentrating on how you're going to structure your story, how you're going to construct the plot, to me is what makes a piece work or not work.
It's great. You guys both come from a place where plot is embraced. When I was going to school, it was almost a dirty word. You wrote the stories. I think, Lynn, you tell the story like you're one of those people that writes a story. Stuff happens because you come with, the great American novel where people are sitting around doing a whole bunch of nothing. Where I was going to get my undergrad, like we were forbade from writing with any genre. And of course, there's plot and other things, but genre, especially the mystery genre, which I write in, highlights what's necessary to have progress and movement and causality. And so going to FIU and studying under Lynn, where I was taught to embrace this idea where things can happen in the story, and that's why people are reading the story. That's really what changed things for me. It got me to look at it from a different point of view and get it from my, because we're fascinated with our own internal mechanizations, but people don't really read to know what's going on inside my head. And what I find interesting, the quirks they read to have the page turned, to be gripped, and that's every genre, to find out what happens next. And once you get a hold of them, that's the way I look at plot, is you pull them along the story with you.
So I was taught, went to an MFA program where we discussed voice, to some degree character, language, all of which was good for me. I had worked a bit on newspapers, so I was used to telling stories and, not in a certain kind of easier writing. So it was good to work on that. But it was also very limiting once I wanted to have more happen on the page. I was getting things published, but I wanted to do more, and I trained myself. So one of the things that I did was look at fairy tales, because fairy tales are like plot machines. They don't have other things. They tend to not really do that much with structure. They're giving you the plot. And then I also somehow simultaneously went and read Aristotle's Poetics, which was a mind blower, because I'd been taught in high school, I believe, primarily that Aristotle said certain things which he doesn't say. He says there's unity of action. He doesn't say time and place. But the other thing is that he is describing structures. There's only certain genres in his time. There's the epic and there's the drama. We don't have his comedy, so that's a different thing. So he's describing those structures and how things work in those structures that are plots. So he's talking about plot, but he's understanding that it's a totally different thing, for instance, to have a play where everybody's on stage and things are coming in and out, or to be following a character and then changing point of view, as happens in the Odyssey, which is more of a thriller structure. And not that he was using those terms. So I looked at that and then went back, and then I just set myself tasks to do something where things changed often, and to have more characters who were active, which I think is really the thing that I saw from the fairy tales. And there's a whole world of fairy tale theory that describes there being sort of 7 kinds of roles that characters play, and you don't have a story without several of them. So that was helpful too, because what I'd been taught was to be so immersed in the point of view characters' deep agony and so on, that you weren't getting the sense of what was constructing it. So then I turned around, because I was already teaching at this point. And one of the reasons I was learning it was because students were asking me questions and I wanted to be able to give answers, and started teaching a class. And the very first time I taught the graduate class in plot, I decided to use a number of books that conspicuously were about plotters plotting. That is, characters were clearly plotting, so that it would become clearer to the students and to me. They also tended to have a lot of paranoia in them for some reason, whatever I was picking. I've done lots of different things since then and taught a lot of people. And what and Joe can speak to this, because there's a resistance to it because of the way you read, and you're attached to a character, and that's what you understand. And screenplay gets you away from that as well, because there's movement, and again, it's more like the drama where you can see the scenes. But you actually have to think essentially about every character at some point or other in the course of writing anything that's going to hang together. So it's not like it eschews character or forces character to be puppets. You really have to get into them.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what did it for me, and this might make me sound extremely simple-minded. I don't mind doing that. But it wasn't until, I was working on my thesis novel, and you had me do the addendum, which I forever thought that's what it was called. I missed a few things about life while I was home. So, certain words just escaped my understanding. But what you had me do is this causality chart where A plus B, so C happens. And it sounds silly, when I explain it now, but, when I was doing it, I would have, a great scene in a cafe with a couple people talking, then I have a great scene across town, a couple people in a car, but nothing was causing the next thing to happen. Without that causality, of course, you can't have tension, you can't ramp up the suspense, wrap up any kind of conflict, because it's all these individualized sort of episodic moments. And the films I love the most, something like Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, which I kept trying to emulate, is a horrible example, because it actually does move forward. It's a brilliant way of storytelling, and don't try to do what he does, because you just can't do it. And it wasn't until you had me do that I recognized that every action has to have a reaction, and not just a reaction to the main character. You have to have a reaction to the sub character, and you can't have people just doing things to facilitate your main character's action, which is, of course, the mistake you make early on. You're like, well, I need to get here, so that doesn't make sense for that. Every character has to have their own motivation, their own way of doing things, and that has to all lead to an organic resolution, conclusion, the next step, which is tough. But the good news is once you get it, it kind of almost becomes second nature. It's part of your thinking. So there is hope. It's just a matter of kind of getting that wheel to click.
There's some questions here about the causality. So I called it a so chart, where you are showing which action. Sometimes there's an immediate consequence, and sometimes you would also have a branch, because there's something else going to come back, later, where there's another consequence. And sometimes I have it divided between on stage and off stage. That is, here's stuff going on, and on stage the reader is seeing what's on stage, as in film. You can see consequence, but there's other things that are consequential happening off stage that will come in, so that there's both short consequences and long consequences. I will say, I'll go back to Aristotle. Aristotle says a plot is not ipso facto a unity if it revolves around one person. That by itself, would be what I was teaching over and over again, because that is we live that way. Somehow it's all, it's coming at me. But having a way to just lay out action, I also will sometimes, it's a so chart, not a show chart. So, but showing is one side of it. But off stage, you can, again, you can think you knew what a certain event caused, but then later it comes back in and you see how 3D the world is. And any way that you choose to represent it for yourself is fine. It isn't like there's a perfect chart, but or that it matters, but just making people have to use I can't mute my phone and speak. I don't know what else to say. If you can't think of it, you need some way to get at it where you're away from the text a little bit.
Do you guys know James Hall?
I teach with James Hall until he retired. Sure.
You teach. I was at a writers' conference with him years ago, and I finished my panel, And this is riffing on what you said, Joe. I went into James' panel to hear him, and I literally stole this exercise for my own students. But he said, this is how you plot a novel, the active voice verb, plot a novel. Because of A, B must happen. Because of the cumulative effect of A and B together, C must happen. Because of the cumulative effect of A, B, and C together, D must happen, has to happen. So if you carry that through the majority of the alphabet, you've got one hell of a plot. And it's all linked together. That narrative causality from the beginning of the piece of the story all the way to the end, it will really carry you through. So when you talked about, Joe, the A and B, that's immediately where I went to, and that was 20 years ago, and I've been using that with students ever since.
This is a quick non sequitur, but every time I hear James W. Hall's name, I remember a line in Tropical Freeze, where he says, good posture, it's something you have to work at. And so when I hear his name, I instantly am aware of how badly I sit. I have to sit up straight. So, thank you, Jim, for that. Yeah, no, fantastic teacher, wonderful guy, and also making me sit up straighter.
Yeah.
So let me go back a minute to talk about structure, because I define structure as the presentation, like how you present it. And there are different structures. So there was a mention last night during the keynote of Christina Baker Klein not particularly liking what essentially would be the big mystery thriller kind of structure, where something comes out very late and everything is changed by it. And that's because she was writing from the point of view of a protagonist who was basically in an adventure. It's all consequential, like one mistake leads on to another thing. But because if you're with that person, that what's happening is there, you're not going to have mystery. You still can have surprise. But there are structures that have very distinct, that become genres, that become publishing genres with different kinds of covers. And so people will prefer a structure. And that's, you can feel like, I love a mystery and I really like a multiple suspect, blah, blah, blah mystery versus no, that's not what I like. So sometimes people will refer to those as plots, but very often you could have the same plot and present it any number of different ways.
I got a question. This guy, he wants to know what the t-shirt says. It says, it doesn't kill you, makes you weird at parties, honey. So honey Rand, just in case you.
I love it. I love it. Years ago, I took, again, when I was in my early days as a screenwriter, when I was soaking up everything I could, I took Bob McKee's story structure weekend conference, which is boot camp. I mean, I walked away from a 3-day conference with nearly 100 handwritten pages of notes. But one of the things that McKee emphasizes is that when you talk about formalized structure, whether it's the 5 components of narrative structure that McKee talks about, or the 12 steps of the hero's journey that Campbell and Vogler talk about, what you're really talking about is an underlying form. The risk you can run into, especially, Lynn, working in genres that have some fairly fixed conventions, is that you can get locked into formula. And you think if you just plug in the pieces, that somehow the piece will magically work. And it's not like that at all. There's a million variations on a theme, and that's where the creative, artsy, talenty part of it comes in. Is you take that underlying form, and then you sort of layer on your own voice and your own characters over it, and you come up with something that's, you hope, different and interesting and compelling.
I don't want to turn this into like my rehashing everything I learned from Lynn, but it does remind me of something Lynn said, that all art is contrivance. And what happens is when somebody says something's contrived, what they're saying is you've done a bad job of hiding the machination behind the scenes. You didn't hide the puppet strings. But what we do is contrivance. So yeah, formula just creates this idea of like it's a bad word. But again, if you do your job well, people don't notice the formula. It's only when you kind of do this ham-handed plug and play thing that people point out, God, that kind of sucks.
The sin is not in contriving. The sin is being caught at it. And
right.
Many years ago, as a quick non sequitur aside, I taught 4 years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary I worked with inmate writers, some of whom were amazing. But we had a workshop one day where we were sitting around a table, and somebody read a chapter from a novel they were working on. And it was, I mean, this guy clearly had found himself a thesaurus somewhere, because it was filled with these flowery words and long sentences and went on and on and on. And he read his piece and he set the paper down waiting for everybody to tell him how great it was. And this one inmate writer to my left looked up and said, "Oh man, we caught you writing." And maybe the cruelest comment I ever heard in a workshop. "We caught you writing."
I would say, I think I normally say it's either well contrived or ill contrived. And one of the other things is there's people have learned to criticize certain things and not notice when the same thing is being used successfully. So I know there was a mini conference at FGCU last November, and I was at that, and I was using Romeo and Juliet. So Romeo and Juliet begins with a big coincidence. No one minds a coincidence as a start because that just happened, as long as it has consequences. But then the degree of intentionality goes up after that. So Romeo just happens to be on the streets, which are the place of coincidence in Verona, Italy, and a messenger is coming around to invite people to a party at Juliet's place. Her father is giving, but the servant is illiterate, and he asks Romeo to read the list to him. So it's an incredible contrivance that the servant is illiterate and happens to speak to a Montague who's from the enemy family it's ridiculous, right? And people die because of that in the long run of the coincidences, and the story itself becomes so exciting. You just had to have a way to get him to start to try to crash a party.
I'm just, I don't know if you guys want to do the same, but I'm just catching some of these questions and writing down the ones that I think we can address later, because then I don't want to miss anybody. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I'll answer them later. I'm just saying, you guys
I was just saying that I'm just reinforcing that, you can go look at something that's a classic and see the thing that you will see in a workshop. Someone says, "I just don't think it would happen that way." And they're not really, they're describing that it isn't capturing them. It's not really that you can't have a contrivance.
I agree. Random events, coincidence can start a story. It's very hard to finish a story.
No, never.
Or to bail yourself out. One of my favorite Bogart movies is a late movie that he did it was the fourth or fifth movie he did with Lauren Bacall, Key Largo. And it's where Humphrey Bogart, the protagonist, just happens to come to Key Largo to visit the family of his dead buddy from World War II. And he just happens to land there at a time when a hurricane's about to hit and mobsters have taken over the hotel. And he just happens to walk into this mess. And it works beautifully.
I have to say that the hurricane coming and the mobsters at the hotel is a continuous condition in Florida. So, it's common enough that those two things would be together, certainly in Key Largo at the time. But I agree. We just accept that. So I think the question about someone saying not fill it with cliche surprises, what you want is that the characters, what they want leads them to take actions, and that those actions will not be predictable if you're putting challenges in front of them. So Romeo crashes a party. He unfortunately meets a girl he's going to die for. He gets ejected from the party. He just goes home and mopes. No fun. He sneaks around back, hops the wall into the orchard, and that leads you to the balcony scene. That is, he now wants to get in, and every single thing that happens after that is from that want. And so it doesn't feel like a cliche. So that's a matter of inhabiting the characters so that you understand their want, and then you drive them to have to do things they wouldn't have done in the first place, but because of these circumstances, they will now do. And that's sort of the test of character that is plot.
And the structure, the plot provides the conflict, creates the conflict that forces your character to dig deeper into themselves and to find stuff they didn't know was there. And it's that driving desire and underlying need is what propels the story forward and keeps your audience interested.
So one of the things I know Joe and I talked about a lot is that there's a tendency to want to protect a character. This is in early days, not anymore. Like this character is, I don't want it to be so tough on this character. And that's a problem if you're too closely identifying with the character, perhaps. Like if you can get some attachment to the character, but also say, no, I'm going to put you through some ordeals. Then you have more story, and that's a kind of,
there's another part of the magic formula. When I teach this, it's a lot easier when I teach this without Lynn, because I just basically parrot everything she says and make myself sound a lot smarter. But the simple formula is I, he, she wanted this, I, he, she did that to get it, and here's how it all went wrong. Because if everything goes right, you don't have a story. And that's really just kind of mimicking real life, because you think of all the things you want, how hard you try to get them, and how rarely you do achieve those goals. And that's just another trick that I've employed to keep things moving and make sure that my characters aren't being overly coddled.
I think it's essential.
I was going to say, Joe's been editing these anthologies, and so the Just to Watch Them Die one has come out since whatever the bio was. So you were looking at a whole lot of different people's short stories, and plot in the short story is also important. I just want to say it's really important. There's like lots and lots of great enduring short stories, and in general they have a strong and memorable plot done in a more miniature form. But I was wondering, when you were doing that editing, how much you had to tell people, like, no, more has to happen, or maybe less has to happen.
When you're editing anthologies, it's tough, because you have different tiers of writers. You don't want to admit that, but the truth is you do. I mean, if Dennis Lehane's giving you a story, you're not doing a whole lot of editing. You're pretty much, there's a spelling error on this page, and you go through it. And so it's usually, you're trying to get a wide spectrum of established authors. At least I try to get everybody involved. So it's usually the authors who maybe are coming just sort of breaking in, who have more difficulty with that sort of thing. And that, it's more hands-on. But, like I said, once you figure this out, it's sort of the nice thing about plot is once it clicks, it kind of clicks for good. It's like riding a bike. You figure it out. Oh, that's how it works. And it's not like you're going to forget how to do it. Before I started writing and before I was having success, the idea of how do I come up with ideas, or how do I make this happen, or how do I do, was so daunting. And it was like staring just into an abyss and a void. And I tried to think my way through it. And you can't really think your way through it. You sort of have to write your way through it. You write, and the synapses fire, and this connects to that, and this connects to that, and you're learning this, and you're reading here. But once you do get past that hump, the good news is you don't forget it. Like it's part of your process now, and it'll stay with you.
It does become ingrained. It really does after a while. And our question that's up on the screen right now is an interesting, the most challenging part of a plot. I think for me is the what I call the ripple effect, which is that everything that happens at a certain point in the story ripples down through the rest of the story, and that keeping track of all that and making it work. Lynn, what you said earlier to me is absolutely essential. The one big risk for plotting a story is being too easy on your protagonist, too easy on your characters. If you don't force them into confronting dangerous situations, great conflicts, great obstacle, then what you've got is a real life story, which is by and large boring. Hitchcock said it in the Truffaut interview the best. Movies are real life with the boring stuff stripped out. It's all larger than life or death in the end.
There's a question here by Arian who's saying, what about subplots? So let me say that the subplot has to be affected by and affect the main plot. It's not like having a separate track. And one of the things that I've seen, I learned from teaching, when I teach plot as a class, I teach some books, but I also have people pick individual books that they admire and would like to study and then look at. And frequently they find that they never really paid attention to various, they just enjoyed it and maybe they read it 37 times. Actually, someone read a book over and over, but never really, it was like, I've gone on that ride and I like going on that ride. So one of the things is that you can't have 57 different things at stake. You have to have, you're in a world in which certain things are at stake. So the subplot should have the same kind of thing at stake. And we're talking a lot here about crimes and thrillers, but you could have a social comedy in which the issue is, sex and love, and you can't just suddenly throw a bomb plot into that. right? You have to have a kind of unity, and in general, you're having to make a bigger so chart, as we were talking about, if you're going to have subplot, and think about where it's placed. So I would always say, pick something that you think does it well, and actually look at how that was structured and what the relationships were and how things changed and where it was placed. And that doesn't mean you steal it exactly, but it makes you conscious that someone did that work and thinking.
I think subplots serve a dramatic function, and they're actually pretty specific. That it resonates against your main story. It's a variation on a main story, or it sets up the main story. And I think, and I hate to keep bringing up movies, but you see this in movies in much clearer than in books sometimes, in novels. But you look at a film like Casablanca, which has 5 separate subplots, one of which is completely resolved by the time the A story even starts, and all of these subplots resonate, set up, make the A story become that much more compelling and real. And so I think I think most writers should think in terms of, how do I create a subplot that's going to work in conjunction with the A plot to make this an even stronger story?
I think of them as furnishing obstacles and opportunities, or opportunities and obstacles. Like in one place they make it easier, and another place they make it harder, so that it's serving and being affected by the main plot. And obstacles and opportunities are something I talk about a lot in the map also of a story, like where there's access and where you have to really try harder to get somewhere. And Casablanca is a great example of that as well. Everyone is trapped in Casablanca. That's like the first premise that you have. These people are there, they're trapped, there's a map picture, and what people will do to get out is part of the testing. And who has the special ticket to get out and who helps who is all set up from the beginning. But people have to change their relationships and tell truths to each other in order to arrive at the outcome. So there's a whole past plot as well that's arriving, that's just arriving right then, that's connecting 2 things up. So the 2 flashbacks that are in that are 2 different sides of the past plot. And
yes.
Once known, then you have the ability to go forward. So, but that's still the same main plot. Make it happen.
We use the movies just because it's distilled, like Vogler does with Campbell. The movies take these books and they just make it more simpler, because you don't have the luxury of, not that you have time to waste in any form, but you certainly can be a little looser with a novel. You have 300 pages with a screenplay. You've got to make it. So get rid of kind of all the extraneous things.
There's a question here saying, do you find your plots to be more character driven or thematically driven? Which makes me think that there's a mistake in the thinking there, because plots happen, are what characters do to, with, and for, and against each other. So they're driving it. And theme is basically subject matter. It's not like, I don't see how theme, like man is doomed, or some kind of theme like that would be an outcome of the plot, but you can't thematically drive it, I don't think.
When writers try to drive their plot with theme, then what usually happens is the story turns into a polemic. You're trying to plot your story to fit the theme that you've already established. Drugs are bad. What are you doing? Whatever political statement you want to make, and boy, when you get away from focusing on character, that's when you start to lose your readers.
But I think it's a great question, because I think a lot of us start out looking at it that way, as though theme can drive a plot, and it can't. I mean, and if you do, you're going to get in trouble. I mean, my point is it has to be a result of the character's actions. That's where the plots have to come from. And theme, is a vital component of story, just like, everything that goes into stories is a vital component.
Go ahead. I was going to say that at one point I was a consultant, strangely enough, on a grant for a theater company in Pittsburgh, and they kept wanting to have sessions for audiences to chat after a play, and they would want to talk about theme. And I kept saying, well, but they all had the same theme, like the death of the American dream. Like, it's like, okay, there's all these plays that are that, but they're different plays. Like what, the theme isn't what makes us care about them. And in fact, I think that some of this just comes from the teaching of literature as trying to teach ideas.
Yeah.
And and trying to pull things out that would be ideas, themes, concepts, the more abstract kind of thing, which is fine, but it's not what makes the work survive.
Now, there's that meme, I don't know if you've seen it go around. It's like your English teacher explaining why the curtains were blue, and it's representing the underlying sadness, and what the writer really meant, the curtains were fucking blue. Like, so, but yeah, you really, they do hammer this idea home that everything, and sometimes the curtains are just blue.
The playwright Arthur Miller, in his, and I forget the year, it was back in the 50s, he did his Paris Review interview, and Miller said that the plot of whatever play he was writing usually came to him in the middle of the third act. That's when he finally realized what this play was about. And he said he typed it out on an index card and tacked it to the wall above his typewriter. And that theme became a way for focusing the rewrites, not the first drafts, not the original writing. He used theme as just a way of focusing.
I mean, I'm not sure we even know always. The theme sort of emerges, or the center emerges as we're writing. There's so many different layers: your conscious, your subconscious. Then you got that stuff deep down inside where, you're tapping into it, but I'm not sure you're entirely cognizant of it from the get-go. Usually, when I start a plot, it's a fairly simple idea. The last book I had, man moves back to town to finish the dream house he promised his dead wife. And then from there, I have a story with several subplots, and it turns into something I had no idea. And I just started with that simple premise. Because I know a lot of people, a lot of questions I'm seeing are like, how do you come up with a plot? And thinking you have to figure out the whole thing is going to keep you from writing. You just need to get you started. And then really your mind will do a lot of this heavy lifting for you. It's doing it now. One of the nice things about writing is you're kind of always, one of the awful things about writing is you're always writing. Even when you're not writing, your brain is kind of doing this work. You're sleeping, you're walking, you're doing whatever. And when you do this for a living, it's 24/7. So a lot of these problems, I just came up before this panel, I just solved my novel in the shower. Listening to Springsteen and solved the novel. Like, great, there it is. I got my next book. Now I got something to do for the next year.
I had a writer director say to me once, and he was talking about a script, goes for novels as well. You never finish a script, you abandon it. You're always working on it, always thinking about it. And it's not done until it's printed and gone. That's it. You abandon it.
I think that there's a desire to draw meaning out. I was going to say your setup, Joe, is not unlike the setup of The Great Gatsby. Man, in this case, he lost the woman and he's trying, again. So one of the other things is I just think that it's very helpful to understand that characters are coming into a story already in a story. They're not just meeting for tea and then a story starts. They've got a drive. And your example is a great one. Here he is. He's already got through all these things, and he's got a mission to do something that he thinks will somehow address, solve, heal, or prove something. And that's all you really need. You need him to come in with some momentum rather than sitting around waiting for something. And I do think that sometimes the way things are taught about, for instance, catalyst kind of fails to get that, because they're seeing the catalyst is coming in, quite late in the game rather than already being in action.
And I'm going to try to remember this, and I'm not going to get the quote right, but it's the E.L. Doctorow quote. I think Anne Lamott quotes in Bird by Bird about driving a car. Writing a novel is like driving a car at night. You don't just need to see as far as your headlights. You can make an entire trip cross country. I'm paraphrasing. But this idea that you have to figure everything out from the get-go, I know that pigeonholed me, and I was really stymied because I feel like I have all the answers from the start, and you really don't. You need a place to start, and you need to go, and then things will happen. Your training will come in, the craft, and it's not hopeless is my point. Because
someone just brought that same quote up to me only a day ago, and I said I spent some time with Dr. Rowe, a couple days, and wandering around in Pittsburgh and stuff. And the thing is that's true as long as there's a road. Like, there still has to be a road that you can drive on. So you can then you've got enough to get you on a road, and you believe that road crosses the country, you can follow your headlights. And that's fine. You don't have to know every single obstacle or complication you're going to run into. There's a lot of comments coming through here, so
Yeah.
I can't keep up. But this is I will say I've been teaching plot at the Sanibel conference for every year that it's happened since the start, and a lot of people are hungry to learn about it. I'm just going to say, and need this and more. So.
Well, as you, Joe, you mentioned, and Lynn, both of you, in your education as writers, that so many creative writing classes talk about voice and art and the artsy stuff of writing, and so few teachers I found really get down in the nuts and bolts. And going back to that first screenwriting class I took, the teacher sat down and said, "This is how you do it. This is how you build this house. You start with a 2x4 and a hammer and a nail, and you just start putting it together and you build it." And that was that I can't tell you how much I finally, and again, I don't go into, I was so desperate to get published in the 80s, I wrote a romance novel. And I'd never written one before, but it was an experiment. And it got me an agent, got me my first agent, but couldn't sell it. So I took a novel. I was afraid he was going to drop me as a client. So I had taken a couple of screenwriting classes. I pulled out a novel I'd written 10 years earlier that had been turned down 22 times. And I spent 6 weeks rewriting it and retyping it into a computer using what I'd learned in screenwriting craft classes. And 6 weeks later, he sold that. He sold that and became my first published novel. And it was all because of what I'd learned about structure and plot and craft.
Someone asked the question, can there be a great story with no plot? So there can be great pieces of writing, but what I find very often is something there's one more question. Great piece of writing, like The Dead in Dubliners, it's taught a certain way that it's all about the last thinking, but that's a Christmas in which by a coincidence, a man discovers that his wife really was always in love with this other guy who died. And everything he thought was not true. And that is, Jim Thompson says, there's only one plot, nothing is what it appears to be. And so there's that plot in a story that people think of as very much about language, subjectivity, and so on. But there is a plot in there. So I think there has to be consequence. If you can just go back to the original situation, like popping out a granny knot, then you haven't gone forward.
I think that the one I always liked was, stranger comes to town and man goes on a journey. Those are the only two stories you can tell, and they're the same story from, just a different point of view.
They said, one more question, but do you have any writing exercises that help with plot development?
Read.
Yeah.
Just read everything. You were mentioning romance, and I remember when I was locked up for the 6 months in rehab and reading just everything I get my hands on, reading a Nicholas Sparks book, things I normally wouldn't read just because everything can teach you. It can teach you something. And the more you read, the more ideas you have to pull from. So, not just your genre, the more you read. And that's another thing. That's how I got published in the first place and I've told Lynn this story was, for years I was trying to get, years, it was probably months, but the way my mind worked back in grad school, I was like, I'm never getting published. I had my first agent like 2 years after get my MFA. But I wanted this magazine, Thuglit, and I desperately wanted it because it was called Thuglit, and they gave you this really cool T-shirt. As you can tell, I'm a big T-shirt guy. And I kept writing stories for Todd Robinson, the editor, and he kept saying, "Thanks, brother, but not good enough." And then one day I was like, you know what? I should read the magazine. And because I'd never read the magazine, I just wanted to be in it because they gave you a T-shirt and it was called Thuglit. And then once I read the magazine, a few issues, I got a sense of what he liked as an editor, and I didn't change who I was. I didn't change my voice. I simply incorporated that almost subconsciously. And first thing I turn in to him after that, he takes and loved, and everything I sent to him afterwards, he took and loved. And it's just a matter of kind of tapping into like the audience and being a part of this greater collective. And I'm out in San Francisco, so it might be a little hippy dippy, but there really is. There's an audience and there's a creator, and you have to be a part of this. And it's not everything you do isn't in a vacuum, and you can't be so different that Tom is going to be listening. But there's a line from one of our favorite singers, Frank Turner: "If you're so different, who cares what you have to say?" So like if you're not speaking a language other people can recognize and be a part of, like being an iconoclast that far off isn't going to help you. because we're all trying to relay, the universal experience and the unique experience, and you're trying to do the inverse. So you take what's universal and render it unique, and take what's unique and render it universal. And that's the communication we have with our audience.
I will say that in my little book, What Editors Want, the thing I keep saying is read the magazine. Read the magazine. I've endlessly had students say, where should I send this story? And I'm like, you have to go read magazines. I can't be the universal knower of magazines. You have to respond to the place that's going to have that work. And the same thing would be true if you are interested in writing in a certain form that look at what's being published and not just what was published. I like the old examples because they're clear, but what's being published and what you respond to that's being published.
And there's a fine line. I mean, you're not pandering. There's a difference. You're not trying to catch a trend. You're not trying to catch the girl on the whatever. But you're simply tuned in and you're tapped into what's going on. And there's a difference between, just trying to write to placate is not going to work. It has to come from the heart. It has to be true. It has to be real. It has to be you. But acknowledging that there's an audience, acknowledging that there's a certain aesthetic going on is a vital component.
I do. The person who asked that question wanted to know if we had an exercise. And I do have one quick one. I created an exercise for a creative writing class I taught, and I used it a couple of semesters because it really worked. Have you guys ever looked at Craigslist? I call this exercise Craigslist Roulette. And there's a section on Craigslist called Missed Connections. People put up these anonymous little 2 and 3 line log lines. I was in the Kroger on Old Hickory Boulevard last Wednesday, and you were the blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman running cash register number 4, and I thought you had the most beautiful eyes I'd ever seen in my life. That's it. Like anybody's going to read it. Like the cashier at the Kroger would find that and go, oh, somebody liked my eyes. But we would go through, I would put the Craigslist misconnections, I would project it on a screen, and we would literally just pick one out randomly and go, okay, that's a nugget for a story. Write 30 minutes on that entry. And we got.
It was a question we got, is where do you come up with ideas? And as a mystery writer, I'll tell you, I just steal from newspapers. I just, you look for unsolved cases and you complete 2 or 3 of them. I've done that with so many books. And the thing is that, all these ideas are simply woman missing, man missing. But once you start telling the story, that's just a starting point. Then your own thing comes into it. And it's going to be unique. It's like being a musician and trying to cover, a Beatles song. It ends up being your version of a Beatles song because it's your sound, your voice, your way of approaching things. So yeah, I ripped right from the headlines, and I've done that. So I think then that's probably one idea I got from you or less, and it's worked out very well.
The challenge is not finding ideas. The challenge is finding good ones that will sustain the story over 400 type pages.
And that reverberate with you so much that you'll have the energy to do the work, because somebody will say, I thought this would sell, so I wrote this, and it's dead because they just didn't actually have that intensity. But I do think that we should have a little Craigslist Roulette anthology.
Or you can be at the party. The favorite thing you'll always hear is, I've got an idea, and I'm going to tell it to you, and you're going to write it, and we'll split the money 50-50, which is great because one, there's no money in writing. And the second thing is, like, the idea is the dime a dozen. It's the writing part that's hard. But yeah, if you do this for a living, you will never come up with somebody being like, I got an idea. I want to tell you. I'm going to split the money. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard that one.
Oh, yeah.
With the university gets people calling up all the time with those kind of proposals. So I see that there's prompts on Writing Class Radio. There's a lot of information coming into the chat, supplementing us, so that I hope everybody who's at the session is having a chance to look at those. There also seems to be some private chat comments, and they include, our time is up.
We need to wrap up. Yeah.
We have to take it in for a landing. So this was so fun. It
was great. I loved it.
This was wonderful, and and don't lose heart. Anybody who's trying to get this for the first time, it really does. It will click. It seems so grand and incomprehensible. But
read Chris Vogler's The Writer's Journey.
Take classes with Lynne Barrett if you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a plot class right now, and are they grateful? I'll have to ask.
Later on, you appreciate down the road. I'm not sure I appreciate it.
Oh wait, that worked. So anyway, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Away on the magic.